Well, today on the show, I'm joined by Benjamin Watkins. Ben joins me to talk about David Hume. Ben's done some incredible work by navigating Hume's writings, a lot of the secondary literature around Hume, and then compiling a lot of this into a really fantastic and fascinating set of documents, which he's working through for a series that he mentions right at the end of the show. So I won't spoil that too much right now. But all I can say is Ben is the perfect person to have on the show today to help us to navigate the juggernaut that is David Hume. Hume's influence spans multiple areas. He was known very well as a historian. David Hume obviously heavily influenced ethics, philosophy of religion, skepticism, political philosophy, and much, much more. We touch all these subjects today, and my hope is that this conversation serves you as an introduction to the life and works of David Hume and sparks a fire in you to go away and read some of the primary sources that we talk about during this conversation, because they're accessible and they're challenging and they are very fundamental to a lot of the places that we've landed within with philosophy today. Anyway, I love this conversation. I've got so much time for Ben and the work that he does over on the Real Atheology podcast. There are links to him and his work in the description, so make sure you check that out. And if it's your first time checking us out here on the show, I'd ask you to subscribe. And then if you're on YouTube, select the bell notification icon. That will remind you whenever we release a new episode of the show. If you wouldn't mind giving this a thumbs up and sharing it with friends, family, followers, we grow because our audience share our conversations with those who they think might find it to be helpful. So please do consider who you think will find this to be a useful conversation, and then, share it with them, and it's much appreciated. Okay, enjoy this conversation with Benjamin Watkins on the life and work of David Hume. Cheers. Hello and welcome to the show. My name's Samuel and today I'm joined by Benjamin Watkins. Ben, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we've spoken on and off for quite a while about Hume a couple of times now. It's been thoroughly enjoyable, and I thought it'd be fantastic to get you to come onto the show today to kind of give us an overview of David Hume, which I'm really excited about. But before we dive into all of that good stuff, and I've got a list of questions here that I'm looking forward to throwing at you and seeing how you respond. Would you mind giving my audience a bit of an overview about who you are, Ben, and the sort of work you do in the space of philosophy?
Yeah, so my name's Benjamin Blakespeed Watkins. That is my real name. What I do is I'm one of the hosts of Real Atheology, a philosophy of religion podcast. And we explore questions in the philosophy of religion from non-theist perspectives. And so we're trying to keep up to date with all the latest work in the philosophy of religion. We're trying to give theists and atheists both the sorts of resources that they may need to try and tackle the big questions of the philosophy of religion. So we have, though we are ourselves naturalists or non-theists or agnostics or whatever, we take these questions in the philosophy of religion very seriously, and we want to try to make progress in the philosophy of religion and help contribute to that conversation that's been going on for thousands of years and will continue to go on into the foreseeable future.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, I absolutely love Real Atheology. So watcher, listener, there'll be links in the description to both Ben and to Real Atheology. So yeah, please do go and check those out. That'll be awesome. Okay, so we're going to dive into David Hume. I've kind of got it structured in a way where we're probably going to be skimming through quite a lot of Hume's life and quite a lot of Hume's work. But I think that's just what I want to do. I want to create almost a sort of teaser for people to want to now go away and begin to actually engage with Hume's works themselves. So let's give a bit of an overview then of David Hume. So I want to look at his early life and his influences. So could you elaborate on the historical and intellectual settings in which David Hume grew up, especially kind of what were some of the significant influences on his philosophical development, especially during the sort of early formative years?
Yeah, so David Hume was an 18th century philosopher, and he really was one of, I don't want to say a pioneer in empiricism, but he's one of the major figures when you hear the philosophy of empiricism. So Hume's kind of the big dog in the yard. And so, what Hume in his early life did was try to solve philosophical puzzles. And his first book was a treatise on human nature, and he described this work as kind of fallen stillborn from the press. Like it wasn't really. Um, he didn't think taken as seriously as he thought the work merited, which now in hindsight we would probably agree with because a lot of his most original and unique ideas were presented in the treatise, but that was more of his younger, what he considered less mature work. Um, but people did take notice of it, so he tried to apply for a teaching position at the University of Edinburgh. So it was a very prestigious chair that he tried to apply for, but he had made enemies. People had read his treatise, and so he was accused of atheism. And so he really became renowned for his time, not so much for his philosophical views at the time, but for his work as a historian. So he wrote A History of England, which was the standard textbook for a very long time after he wrote it. And so that gave him kind of the financial and social security in order to run around in elite circles while also making a comfortable living. And so he later in his life wrote a treatise concerning human understanding. And so this is what he considers his more mature work. And so over the course of thinking about what his writings in the treatise, they kind of get summarized into an inquiry concerning human understanding. And that's really just an amazing piece of philosophy that endures today as an introductory text to philosophy. So you could sit down as a philosophy 101 student and pick up Hume's inquiry and really take a lot from it. I mean, really, really take a lot as far as important philosophical ideas and important ways of seeing these big questions in ways that are still relevant to those discussions today in very enormously influential ways. Um, and then finally, he had some other philosophical writings that were certainly more important there. But the three big ones, the first being the treatise, the second being an inquiry concerning human understanding. But kind of what I take to be his finest work and his magnum opus was published posthumously, and it's called Hume's Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. And so, not only do I think that this is an important piece of philosophy, specifically philosophy of religion, I think it's also an achievement of literature. So I think it's one of the best uses of the dialogue format since Plato. Um, so I think it's as far as works in the English language goes, I think Hume is the best philosopher to write in English. But I also think that his dialogues concerning natural religion is his finest work. So I think that if you want the best philosophy has to offer in the philosophy of religion, I highly, highly recommend picking up Hume's dialogues and really poring over them, not just giving it a one-time read, but I mean reading it over and over again throughout, now and in the future, using secondary literature, because it really is that important, I think, as far as if you want to think really seriously about the philosophy of religion from your experience of the world. Like if you want to say, look, hey, I want to try to get to a natural religious belief from my experience of the world. And so I think, a lot of theists want. That's what they are looking for in the philosophy of religion. And atheists, it's what they should be engaging with, whether or not they are or not. They should be trying to understand all the views and all the different moves that you can make when you think about ultimate questions of things like, why is there something rather than nothing? Why do we observe the sort of order that we see in the world? And how does evil kind of affect that calculus? And Hume, I think, just gives it a brilliant treatment, and that treatment is still relevant to the philosophy of religion today. We still kind of start in the same places where Hume and Immanuel Kant kind of left us. They really kind of set the stage for what is today modern uh, philosophy of religion, or contemporary philosophy of religion.
Amazing. That's such a great introduction. We kind of hit so many high notes there as well. We'll dive into a lot of those as we go. I think I kind of want to rewind us then right back to something you said right at the start, where he was applying to have like a chair at a university. I think it was Edinburgh University you mentioned, and he's rejected because of his works, and he's almost kind of cast as an atheist. Now, to some people listening, that might be a bit of well, why does that matter? Because they're not really aware of kind of what the environment or the culture was like during the time that Hume was writing these works and engaging with other philosophers. Would you mind kind of giving us a bit of a bird's eye view or a 30,000-foot view of kind of what society was like back when Hume was writing these philosophical works?
Right. So it was not really socially or academically acceptable to come out as someone who was an avowed atheist. So figures like Thomas Hobbes and Baruch Spinoza, who all denied that they were atheists, their philosophies were still taken as atheistic, and they served as the paradigm. Like, oh well, if you want an atheistic philosophy, just read Thomas Hobbes, read Baruch Spinoza. Well, Hume kind of gets lumped in there with him too, and so I think that this is my speculation, is that I think that Hume just really hated that. I think that he thought that his ideas weren't reaching people the way that he wanted them to, so he cleverly had to write his ideas in ways that would not stir waves with religious orthodox authorities of his time, because he had to learn kind of the hard way, that if you make, the types of things that you publish can make enemies for you, that will ultimately block your career progress. And so I think we see, especially in his inquiry and certainly in the dialogues, Hume being artful and careful about how he presents ideas and putting distance between himself and the ideas as he's presenting them. So to give an example, Hume didn't publish section 10 of what became his inquiry, the infamous chapter of miracles, because he thought that that would be too disruptive. And so he included it in his inquiry, but then in section 11, he goes on to critique the argument from design. But he does it in a dialogue form. And so he has two people dialogue with each other. So he puts some distance from him. Well, he still obviously stirs up trouble with the inquiry. And so he holds off on the dialogues. I mean, his first draft was done somewhere around 1751, and he basically sits on it until like 1776. Tweaking it here and there little bits, but it was more or less done for over 20 years. And he just kind of sits on it because he's worried about how it will upset religious orthodoxy. But in the dialogues, he not only puts ideas in character form, three different characters, and kind of pits them against one another, he even puts another layer of distance from the ideas by having two friends recount this conversation that three people had. So there's even further distance. And so I think that's Hume trying to separate himself from the religious hostilities of the time, because I think that what Hume is trying to do is there's important themes throughout Hume's work, and I think those three things are naturalism, skepticism, and religion. And so, like, these are all the kinds of things that he's trying to reconcile in a way. He's trying to reconcile his naturalist philosophy with the problems that are posed by skepticism so that he can come to a deeper appreciation of religious questions.
Amazingly said, Ben. You kind of touched as well when you kind of started originally about sort of empiricism. And I guess it kind of falls into two things. You kind of got human perception and knowledge. So I think it'd be helpful to kind of understand how his ideas about human perception and knowledge challenge the philosophical thoughts of his time. Because I think today we kind of just recognize there are many different ways of understanding knowledge and perception, and we kind of almost overwhelmed with the various routes of philosophical inquiry that we can go down. But back then he was kind of pushing into things that weren't necessarily new, but were definitely challenging. So yeah, kind of, I don't know, I'll pass it back to you to talk about human perception and knowledge, please.
Yeah, so one of Hume's enduring contributions is one of both originality and one of clarity. So, in an inquiry concerning human understanding, section 4, for example, Hume begins to talk about causation and, cause and effect, as well as our experience of the world, how it is that we come to knowledge of the world. So there's what's called Hume's fork. So Hume divides knowledge into two categories. He thinks that there's a priori knowledge and there's a posteriori knowledge. So what do those fancy terms mean? So a priori knowledge, Hume thinks, are our relations of ideas. So as we experience the world, impressions, our sense data, the world impresses itself on us. Those impressions become our ideas. And then the relations of those ideas are constitutive of our a priori knowledge. So these are things like mathematics, geometry, logic. These are what Hume thinks is the realm of a priori necessary truths. And he thinks that a posteriori knowledge is the knowledge that we get from experience. So specifically going out and seeing cause and effect in the world, the constant conjunctions of certain objects that our mind then orders into cause and effect. But all of this seems very natural in section 4 to people of the time who were familiar with the philosophy. But then all of a sudden, Hume starts to question that, the idea of how it is we are going beyond our experience and coming to the conclusion that the future will resemble the past. Why does the future resemble the past? And so we can't say that it's a relation of ideas, because for Hume, a relation of ideas implies a contradiction. But there's no contradiction implied by the idea that the future will change, that we'll just drop an apple one day and it'll float up instead. That doesn't entail any sort of contradiction. So it must be something known. It can't be known a priori. It must be something known a posteriori. Well, in order to go out and see if the future resembles the past, you would have to presuppose that the future resembled the past. You would have to assume cause and effect and an inductive principle to even go out in the world and try to make that intelligible. So you would just be reasoning in a circle. So we can't know that the future will resemble the past either a priori or a posteriori. So how do we know it? And so so obviously I explained this rather clunky, and gave the brief, soundbite version of the problem of induction. But Hume characterizes this problem in not only amazing prose, but also language that it's incredibly clear what the problem is and what you would need in order to solve it. And Hume's very honest about it, saying like, look, I can't figure out this problem. And it seems so weird that I wouldn't be able to figure it out because, something like induction, like something in going and observing causes and effects, constant conjunctions in the world, this is something that animals do, that children do. This was something I was doing inside my crib, as he ends the chap is what he says. As he ends his chapter, he's like, if there's some sort of argument that is intelligible from when I was still in a cradle, what was that? What was that argument? And if I can't now produce it, he has to confess that he's this really backward scholar who can't articulate an argument that was familiar to him before he could walk. It was an argument that's familiar to beasts who can't even speak. And so he takes this idea of constant conjunction and induction, this idea of the future will resemble the past, it's just an instinctual belief. Like we can question it in the abstract and we can worry whether or not it's true. And we can let skepticism take over us. But at some point, just the very nature, the nature of human understanding, the nature of what it is for us to be cognizers in the world just has to take the principle of induction on faith, really, in the sense of you can't give any evidence for it. There's no evidence that could confirm it. There's no evidence that could disconfirm it. And doubting it doesn't imply a contradiction. So we're just kind of stuck in this. And that's a problem, it seems very obvious once he lays the problem out. How could we have gone all these thousands of years without seeing this problem? But Hume made it very clear and very pressing of, hey, here's the problem. And that problem, I think, still stands today. I don't think there is a satisfactory solution to the problem of induction because there can't be. It's just the limits of human understanding are narrow. And the answer to this question is just beyond human understanding. And that it's just, thousands of years from now when we have the most advanced technology and, just the most amazing things that would, seem like magic to us now, I think we will still have the problem of induction. I think that will still just be a feature of human understanding that we, computer scientists will go, oh yeah, like you just couldn't figure that one out. That was just beyond human nature, and there was no way for humans to ever solve that problem. And that's why it's a perennial problem in philosophy now.
Oh man, there's so many threads that we could pull on here and dive further in. But yeah, let's push in. So I'm aware that most of these questions are going to be things that we've touched on briefly, so we're going to try and dive a little bit deeper now into these things. So I want to talk about a treatise of human nature. So this is obviously considered to be one of his seminal works, and you kind of mentioned this briefly, but just to make sure it's spelled out really, really clearly, how was the treaty or the treatise received during his time, and how did it influence subsequent philosophical discourse, both for Hume and for those who were writing as his contemporaries?
So it didn't have the effect that he wanted it to have initially. So it likely was not as influential as he intended for a very long time, almost up until the point of Bertrand Russell, kind of 100 years or so after his death, did the treatise kind of start to get more traction. People were returning to it and seeing the originality and clarity of ideas there. So Kant famously said that he was awakened from his dogmatic slumber by Hume. And so, Kant went on to achieve great things in philosophy because he had read Hume. Well, what did he read? He read An Inquiry in Human Understanding. There's no evidence that Kant was ever able to obtain a German translation of Hume's earlier work, the Treatise. So we know that Hume's later works were much, much more influential than that treatise was. But that's not to say that his treatise didn't cause waves or that it wasn't influential to people of the time, because there were people that read it and were influenced by the ideas that Hume put out. Because keep in mind that Hume's writing kind of in the wake of Locke and is a contemporary of Berkeley, Bishop Berkeley. And so these are the other three big empiricist figures in Western philosophy. And so it's mixed up all in that. And I think, I would have to dig much deeper to see, what were the actual historical influences of the treatise of the time. I don't know. It's all I can really say is it wasn't that big. It wasn't until much later that certain ideas. So that in the treatise, this is where Hume gives his famous distinction between is and ought. This is where we first see his ideas of the bundle theory of the self. So this idea that the self is an illusion and that really all we are through time is this bundle of impressions. So these are where, that's where those ideas really start to take off, is about 100 years after his death, and really kind of in the rise of both American pragmatism and kind of the Bertrand Russell, G.E. Moore analytic philosophy. That was really kind of the return to Hume's treatise. And it went on to be hugely influential, certainly around the logical positivist movement, so the Vienna Circle. So the idea that meaning of statements required this kind of empirical verification that Hume was talking about. So the Vienna Circle kind of inserted Hume's logical empiricism into their positivist program. And so I think that's where the Hume's influence from the treatise really, kind of caught fire, in that it just spread and had this enormous influence. And now, obviously, the influence of logical positivism has receded, but I don't think Hume's logical empiricism has. I think most people generally agree that Hume's starting places are good places to start, but they're not happy with where he ends up. They think that it's a dead end and that we need something more in human understanding. Now, what that more is that human understanding needs, that's where the controversy comes in. So a priori and a posteriori, that distinction is very widely conceded. So to start with a relation of ideas and matters of fact, Hume's fort, is a good starting point. But what else is there to it? That's a much more difficult question. And Hume's treatise, I think, gives us a very negative answer in saying there is nothing but, like, that's where we're stuck. Like, that's just the limit of human understanding. We can play around with our ideas all we want, and we can examine the world as much as we want, observe it, but we can't go beyond that. That's just kind of where human understanding meets its wall.
I want to invite you to join our community on Locals. There is a range of free and supporter-only benefits to check out. On Locals, you can ask guest questions, access the reading plan to prepare for upcoming conversations, get early access to all the full-length video and audio versions of each episode, and meet like-minded followers of the show. The link is in the description, and I hope to see you there. So fascinating. Yeah, it really is. Okay, so Hume obviously wrote extensively about ethics and morality. I think it would be interesting to delve into his ideas about moral sentiments and their role in ethical decision making.
Yeah, so this is where Hume has obviously been very, very influential, but where I think is his weakest part of his philosophy. So I myself don't follow Hume in the realm of ethics, because I think that his view just ends up having very implausible consequences that Hume himself admits. Tis not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my little finger. And so what he's saying is that, like, ethics is fundamentally about the sentiments that we feel. And so if we feel the sentiment of desperately not wanting to cut our our little finger off, but we don't have a similar sentiment about the destruction of the whole world. That mismatch in sentiment is not contrary to reason. There's not something about a relation of an idea that it was impressed upon us from the world that will make that contrary to reason. And so I don't think that's right. But there are a lot of people that do think that Hume's what is called ethical sentimentalism really is all there is to our moral discourse. And so if we want to know what it is we should do morally, we should look inside and see how observing certain acts strikes us. So if we were to imagine the idea of a child being tortured merely for fun, that sentiment would strike us with horror. We would have this impulse from within to say that no, that's not something that we should do. And so that this concept of should or ought or must doesn't go beyond this human sentiment. So in a very real sense, Hume reduces ethics to psychology. It's not a matter like when we ask, what should I do? The question we should think that question states is, what do I most want? Or what is my strongest sentiment in this situation? And so that, to my mind, is a psychological question. And so Hume puts forward what's often called a subjectivist view of ethics, kind of a naturalist. There's still truths about, he's not a non-cognitivist. He's not saying that our moral language doesn't function the way we think it does. He just thinks that the clockwork of ethics is limited to those passions that we feel, the sentiments that arise when we make judgments, and so that's just the only material that we have for ethics to go by. And so modern, what are called ethical constructivists, and a good example would be Sharon Street. She's what's called a Humean constructivism. And she thinks that, look, our systems of ethics, of morals, are just our systems of sentiments. We construct ethics in the sense that we build elaborate systems that fit human sentiments. Our morality takes the shape that it does because human sentiments take the shape that it does. And so that there aren't things like status independent or stance independent facts about what we should do, or about what is good and bad, or about what is right and wrong. And so Hume was not only influential in that meta-ethical realm of his sentimentalism, but he was also a forerunner to people like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, so the utilitarian tradition that developed in the English-speaking world in Hume's wake. Hume was very influential in that respect too. Obviously, Hume's famous contribution to ethics, the one that I do accept, is his famous distinction between is and ought. And so what Hume is getting at is that he notices in a lot of moral philosophy, there's this movement from judging the way the world is to then judging the way the world ought to be. And so he thinks that these are just different concepts. And so that if you have nothing but premises that make judgments about the way the world is, nothing of any moral significance, no ought truth is going to follow from that. And so what we get from Hume is this very sharp distinction between a domain of is facts and a domain of ought facts. But then Hume goes on to reduce those ought facts. Once he's made those clarifications, those those conceptual clarifications, he then reduces the ought concepts to is ones. And so I think he ultimately falls on his own sword here. This is the idea. Well, why I say I don't follow Hume and his ethics is I think that there's this very deep tension between Hume's is ought distinction on the one hand and his sentimentalism on the other. I think those are on a collision course that we can either accept one or the other. If we're going to reduce morality to psychology, then we're going to have to reject the is ought gap. If we want to say that no, is and ought really are two distinct conceptual frameworks that state different truths, then we're not going to be able to reduce ethics to sentimentalism. And so I think that's just kind of a dilemma that Hume's philosophy, he wasn't omniscient. Hume didn't get everything right. And I think that this is just a very obvious way of seeing, like, hey, Hume was, for all the brilliance and all the influence that these thoughts have had, these don't fit together. And that's not unheard of in philosophy. So Wittgenstein is a very similar figure in that there's considered this earlier Wittgenstein and later Wittgenstein, and they just don't fit. Like, you just can't reconcile the two. All you can do is say, look, here's one way of reading the Tractatus, and then here's another way of reading the philosophical investigations. One of them is going to undermine the other. They can't both be true. And I think that's just kind of where we're left with Hume's ethics. If he wants to reduce ethics to the relations of ideas and matters of fact, he's not going to be able to use that is-ought distinction. And if he uses that is-ought distinction, he's going to need something more than his moral sentimentalism.
Wow, what a fantastic overview of that. I think Hume is such a juggernaut, right? And he still dominates so much of the landscape. I think very often people get involved in different areas of philosophy and fail to kind of recognize just how broad or wide-reaching Hume's influence has been on various aspects. Obviously not everything within philosophy, but there's so many strong tangents or strong lineages from Hume's thought to where we are today in certain things like philosophy of religion or ethics, etc. It's fascinating. And obviously there was sort of controversy during his time, shortly after his death, when Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion was released. And then obviously kind of up to the present day, there have been different sort of challenges or controversies leveled against him almost. So, but I think it'd be helpful just to kind of talk about any of the major controversies that Hume either faced in his own life, as well as kind of anything that's happened post his passing. Kind of what have been the big things that he had to overcome, not just as a physical being, but also as a philosophical juggernaut, to be able to, I guess, maintain the influence that he seems to have had even down to today.
Yeah. So Hume, for his time, obviously struggled with trying to secure a post early in his career because of, in the wake of his treatise concerning treatise of a human nature. But Hume was also someone who struggled almost certainly very severely with depression. So now, obviously, we are looking back in hindsight, and so we are, kind of diagnosing David Hume using methods that really require these methods didn't exist when David Hume was, and so you would really need to have a clinical psychologist evaluate someone before you really make that sort of judgment. But it's, I think, very widely conceded that there were periods in Hume's life where he suffered greatly from isolation and took steps to seek medical help and make changes to his life in order to get past these very difficult times in his life. So he never married. There is some speculation that when he was older, he was in correspondence with someone kind of 20 years younger than him, and that they were kind of flirting back and forth. But it there's nothing definitive there. There's no real evidence to say, that they did anything other than just being very flirty with each other in the letters that they wrote to each other. But Hume very much struggled with his weight. So by the time he was approaching his death, he was a very morbidly obese individual. He was not one to turn down cheese and wine, and he was not the most physically active individual. And so I think he had a lot of health issues just stemming from his weight and kind of the indulgences of, because keep in mind at the time, once he's written a history of England, he's kind of secured himself financially, and he's also made inroads with, the biggest circles of thinkers of the time, and he's in court a lot. He's dealing with politicians, he's dealing with doctors, he's dealing with philosophers, he's dealing with historians, and he's hosting people like this. He's attending big parties, and so he's living kind of that as much as a Scottish intellectual could live, that sort of life. Because keep in mind, back then there was also Scotland and Ireland both were very much oppressed by English government. And so, there was only, Hume had his eyes set on a prestigious post at the University of Edinburgh, but, he wasn't going to get a prestigious post at, say, like Oxford University, because, that's just, Scottish individuals just didn't rise to that level of prominence back then, because those were just the inequality regimes of the time. So I think Hume very much struggled with his life, both with his physical health and with his mental health. And I think that study and inquiry for him was one of those things that was in a way therapeutic to him. So I think he just kind of lost himself in books. The reason why his history of England is such a penetrating history of England is because Hume was so well read. He spent so much time alone in his study, just reading, just anything he could get his hands on, and just reading, taking notes, and then and really mastered the English language and English prose to then write just amazing, detailed, original, and clear, both philosophical writings, political writings. So he was a good friend of Adam Smith. So anyone who's taken a course in economics is familiar with Adam Smith and his invisible hand. So Hume's writing treatises in the political domain. He's writing philosophical treatises in the philosophical domain. He's writing historical works, and so he's just kind of all over the place. But I really think what kind of allowed him to have the reach and breadth he did was because of his struggles with his mental health. His outlet for those struggles are what were able to propel him to be so widely educated and then so widely influential.
And would you say within his writings then that it's more sort of philosophy of religion that has caused the controversy or been controversial, or did his ethics play any kind of sort of controversial role, or maybe even the sort of his political work as well? I've got a question on his political contributions shortly, but were there any sort of tendrils or avenues of investigation that Hume went down that sparked more controversy than others?
So certainly the religion one, obviously. So I think that Hume's naturalistic empiricism, his battle with skepticism, and religion are the three big themes that you see very consistently throughout Hume's philosophy. And so I don't think Hume struggled as much with his political conclusions or his ethical conclusions or even his scientific conclusions themselves. I think what he was really struggling with were the big questions of religion. And so I have my own interpretation of the dialogues here, and that each of the three characters reflect Hume. There's a big question of who speaks for Hume in the dialogues. Is it Cleanthes? Is it Philo? Or is it Demea? And I think the answer to that question is yes. So I think that these all reflect Hume's thoughts in some way or another. So when we see the character of Demea, we're seeing Hume's own religious conservatism, trying to find that certainty in a priori knowledge for the dogmas of religion. So that this is probably the early Hume saying, okay, I have these religious beliefs. I want to secure them philosophically, and then not being able to achieve that end. And so that's why Demea leaves the dialogue before the dialogue ends. And that's Hume dropping us a hint, saying that that's the young Hume. He tried to make that work out, and it just didn't work out, and he had to just kind of abandon it. And so that's why you see this huge battle between Philo and Cleanthes. Philo being that more skeptical, and Cleanthes being that more natural theologian. But they're both empiricists. And so what we're seeing is Hume trying to use science to justify his religious beliefs. He couldn't get it with the a priori reasonings of Demea and cosmological and ontological arguments. So he tries to do it this scientific way, his naturalistic empiricism, to try to, through the design argument, get to God. And he just doesn't quite get there. And so you're kind of why do people say that Philo speaks for Hume the most? Well, because that's the reflection of Hume's most mature thought. We see these other two characters were Hume's other attempts to justify those religious beliefs that I think were very important to him. People say that Hume was an atheist. I don't think that's right. I think he was a theist. I think he was, an attenuated deist. His theism got so watered down by the end of it that what was left over just didn't seem religiously significant. And so that Hume's view in the end is just to say, look, a lot of this is based on faith and the nature of God. Even if I concede that God exists, his nature is incomprehensible to me. So all I can do is piously attribute, certain things to him, say that he kind of resembles human intelligence, but a lot of this other, the forms of worship, the idea of prayers being answered, miracles being performed, I think Hume had to jettison all of that. And I think that was really hard for Hume. I think certainly you see, if my interpretation is right, that Cleanthes and Demea are these attempts by Hume, these good faith, to try to take reason to religion. If they just missed, if they just fell short, I'm sure that was a very difficult thing for him to have to come to terms with, this kind of what he calls in his inquiry academic skepticism, or a mitigated Pyrrhonian skepticism. This idea that, look, he can go about his daily life, but really when it comes to these deep metaphysical questions, they're just too far beyond his narrow understanding. And that's what's hard, is learning to live with the fact that it's just beyond your knowledge, and you have to just kind of suspend, you're left in this kind of agnosticism, and there's just nothing else to say. And so I'm sure that was difficult. If you're going on this spiritual quest and then you just come up on dead end, not quite dead end, but not really satisfying route, is really kind of where the dialogues leave you. They leave you with this kind of wondering, well, okay, I can say that the universe had a cause, but it's entirely incomprehensible to me, and I'm not entirely sure what religious significance it has to my life. So I just have to keep going on living my life, and that's all I can say.
The dialogues concerning natural religion are absolutely incredible and absolutely fascinating. I think for me, the thing that hit me the hardest when I first read them through was It's almost as if, and you mentioned this sort of these three parts within Hume coming together and kind of talking and moving forwards and trying to provide answers to problems or solutions, and then being challenged and having to try and keep walking down the road, even if at the very end there isn't an answer. Like, we want the answer, yes, right, does God exist or does God not exist? We want either that to be positive for a negative or positive for a positive. What I find fascinating then really is it's almost like the seminal work to show that individuals throughout history have tried earnestly to seek and to know and to interact with God, whatever sort of form you want to interpret that in, whether it be the sort of Christian God or a sort of more deistic God, some sort of supernatural being that has caused everything that they can interact with. And in the dialogues, you have this beautiful unraveling of an individual's vigor towards that certainty that they once held, and having, as you said, this watered down theism moving into deism as time goes by. He obviously kind of puts forward lots of different sort of theistic arguments, such as the argument from design, right? And he obviously has arguments for them. But what I find fascinating is obviously Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, published in 1776, I believe, whereas The Origin of Species was published in 1859. And people often point to The Origin of Species as the sort of thing that put an axe into the tree of the design argument. But obviously, people like Hume and others before him and during his time were presenting arguments against the design argument that didn't obviously have anything to do with evolution per se, because evolution was something that was beginning to come to the fore. Obviously, it wasn't fully published in Charles Darwin's Origin of Species until almost 100 years later. So, Ben, can you just chat through the sort of way that Hume would, I guess, give argumentation against things like the design argument? Like, how was he going about presenting things? Because we take things like evolution for granted today, right? Whereas someone like Hume didn't know this stuff. So, yeah, how did he tackle with those sort of big overarching questions?
So this is a great question. So Hume dies in 1776, and the dialogues are printed posthumously about, I think it was like 3 years later in 1779. And so you're right that it's like 80 years, it's something like 80 years later until Darwin's On the Origin of Species. And so Hume is, you know, kind of seen as dealing, a really big body blow to special creation, or the design argument. But Hugh or Darwin is, kind of seen as knocking, landing that knockout blow. Like, it never, the design argument certainly still endures today, but it's never had the prestige that it had following Darwin. And so, why is that? So, and I find this question absolutely fascinating, because Hume, to my mind, really comes close to landing on the theory of evolution. Now, he wouldn't have gotten the mechanisms. He wouldn't have been able to say evolution via natural selection. But he very much in the dialogues articulates a naturalistic, mindless chance process, like evolution via, random mutations and then non-random environmental pressures selecting for, populations in gene pools. He gets very close to that in very general terms. So in the dialogues, Cleanthes is appealing to the order that we observe in the world, this curious adjustment of means and ends. And how do we explain this? And so Cleanthes is obviously explaining this by an intelligence, by reason. So the principle that he's appealing to is reason, intelligence, something like human intelligence. Like effects have like causes. The world resembles a machine or that of human art and contrivance. So the world has a cause similar to the cause of human art and contrivance. Intelligence, like a human mind. And so Hume wants to say, okay, well, let's look at experience and see, like, you and I obviously agree that order comes from experience, with our comes from intelligence, and the intelligence that gives rise to that order, its cause is unknown to us. So we know that there are these intelligence can cause order, but we don't know what causes that intelligence to give order to what it does. So when we build a machine, we can say, yeah, like it was my intelligence that allowed me to build this machine. But what caused my intelligence to be able to build this machine? We don't really know. We can't just observe that cause. And so what Hume wants to say here is that the world of ideas requires causes just like the world of material objects. So if you're going to say, look, order in material objects requires a cause, you're also going to have to say that order in a mind requires a cause. So what does the order in a mind, what sort of causes does that look like? Well, the only examples that we can give from our experience, Hume says, are vegetation and generation. So the idea of a plant growing and releasing a seed, and then it growing into another plant, bringing a seed into another plant. And so he's saying, like, look, the seed causes the plant, but then the order grows out of the seed. We don't really understand how that order comes from it. We don't necessarily understand that cause. So we have intelligence. Order comes from intelligence. Don't really understand that. Order comes from vegetation. Don't really understand that. Order comes from generation, so the copulation of animals, us having sex with other people, then getting them impregnated, going through a period of pregnancy, giving birth. That comes to order. So we have three different hypotheses on the table. We have intelligence as one principle, and we have generation in one principle, and we have vegetation in another principle. And so he says, look, the evidence supports all of these equally. Like, there's not like, if we wanted to decide this question of the origin of the world, is it reason, vegetation, or generation? There's no contradiction in assuming any of them, because they're all on the same footing as a relation of ideas. So what observation, what matter of fact out in the world can we go out and look at that is going to decide this controversy? And he's going to say there's not a whole lot. But in fact, what we can observe is going to favor generation and vegetation more than it's going to favor reason and intelligence. Why? Because we see reason and intelligence come from generation. We see, like, when you and I were born, our intelligence came from that generation. But we never see intelligence give rise to generation. You and I, it's an empirical fact that none of us can create life by just our intelligence. Like, that's a human experiment we haven't been able to do. We can't replicate. So we have evidence of reason coming from generation. That's consistent with human understanding in our experience. But what's not consistent with human understanding and human experience is intelligence giving rise to a unique process of generation or vegetation. And so really this is going to boil down to, we have more evidence for a mindless chance process like vegetation and generation than we do for intelligence, art, and contrivance giving rise to generation and vegetation. So that's what we have more reason to think that the world was spun from the belly of an infinite spider than we do that it was from the brain of an intelligent being. And you might say, oh, well, that's ridiculous. Like, why would we, give the origin of the world to, such a small creature like a spider? And, Hume wants to say, well, why would you give it to such a strange creature like human beings? Like, you're making the model of the universe us in the same way we could make the model of the universe a spider. And I have more evidence for the spider hypothesis than I do for the human hypothesis. I know that the spiders, through generation, can give rise to order. I don't know that human intelligence can give rise to something like generation or vegetation. And so that's really, I think, the body blow to the design argument, in that the two hypotheses here are intelligent design and mindless chance processes. At the end of the day, what's consistent with our experience, what we discover in science, is that mindless chance processes give rise to things like intelligence through like a mindless chance process like biological evolution selects for intelligent beings like us that have intelligence. And so that's the final knockout blow that was provided by Darwin. Is he actually explained those mechanisms of how a mindless chance process can give rise to intelligence and give the appearance of design. So what Philo ends up conceding to the design argument is that when we look at the world, it just strikes us as something, it's like finding a watch on a heath, the William Paley argument. And so that it just strikes us. And so that there's this appearance of design that's a natural belief. And that it's because of it, it's this natural belief that we should give attention to it. We should give weight to it. It's like induction. Like, it just strikes us as obvious that, like, the future has to resemble the past. We just have to make, like, when we look at the world, we just have to see it as something that looks like it's designed. Darwin does away with that. Darwin says, yeah, it might look like it's designed, but this is why it looks designed. It can explain the appearance of the design, and it can give you the specifics of those mechanisms. That's what Hume lacked. Hume gave the framework for dealing a knockout blow to the design argument, but it was really Darwin that filled in, seeing that vegetation and generation are just two different variations of a much larger mindless chance process that is biological evolution by natural selection. And so a lot of people want to say, the modern versions of the design argument, like the fine-tuning argument, will say, look, that it appeals to these cosmic observations and not these local observations that can be explained by biological evolution. We can't extend biological evolution to the cosmos because that's just not the applicability of that theory. And in one sense, they're right. That's not like we can't extend biological evolution by natural selection to the cosmos as a whole. But we can extend a mindless chance process as a potential hypothesis to explain the order that we do. Perhaps something like a multiverse hypothesis explains this data. Perhaps there's some sort of, cosmic selection process that selects universes with certain properties. We don't know. The point still stands from Hume that, look, we have, like, when we're talking about the whole world, what is most consistent with our experience is that order arising from a mindless chance process. And what's not consistent with our experience is something on that scale coming to being because of intelligence. And so it's that move. It's the move of saying, well, this resembles the sort of order we find in human objects. Hume's going to want to say that resemblance is very, very small. And there's much more resemblance to hypotheses that are entirely incompatible with it, like vegetation, generation of worlds.
Amazing. So I want to get as close as we can do to Hume's mind around the publishing. So kind of his thoughts and his mind on the subject of publishing dialogues concerning natural religion. So we've kind of said that he started this probably sometime in the 50s, 1750. He dies in 1776 and they're published, as you said, 3 years later in 1779. We obviously know that Hume showed early versions of the dialogues concerning natural religion to friends and acquaintances and got their feedback from them, and they all said, don't publish this. This should not go out. So he kind of saves some money and he passes it over to, I believe, his nephew. So upon his death,
Yes,
his nephew has this money, so he can then go off basically and publish the dialogues concerning natural religion. Do you think that is actually what Hume wanted? That there was any regret that he wouldn't be able to see the the impact that the dialogues concerning natural religion was going to have, because he's been crafting this thing for 27 plus years, right? Going at it, working it through. This all links back to even earlier works from before the 50s, his thoughts, his ideas. He's been spending so much time making every word mean something important and taking away the kind of chaff that isn't needed. And then he's left with this thing that he knows is going to have an impact, but he's never going to see this impact being played out within society. So is there any way, any of his writings, any of his memoir, anything for us to get close to his thoughts and feelings around the recognition that he's never going to see this thing getting published?
So unfortunately, I'm not aware of him expressing in writing his regret for not being able to publish it the way he wanted to. However, I'm very confident in saying that I think that this was a very, very difficult decision for him. So I think that the pressure from his friends is really what kept him from publishing it, because I think he was ready to publish it. He wanted it to be out there. He wanted to see what kind of impact it could have, and he thought that these ideas were very, very important. But he also recognized the reality that he lived in, and so you can see that he's takes a lot of in from his writing, from the letters that I have read, that as he's closing in on his death, he knows that he's going to die soon, and so he's putting kind of these last finishing touches on the dialogues. But he's also very sensitive to the fact that what he's going to ask of someone to do is a big ask. To say, publish this very controversial thing. So he could have gotten any one of his, he could have gotten Richard Price, he could have gotten Adam Smith. There was many different big figures that he could have tasked with, kind of releasing this stuff and making sure that it ends up in the right ways. But he has his nephew do it, and I think that's deliberate. Because no one is going to blame this nephew for fulfilling the dying wishes of his very famous uncle. They're going to see it as, okay, well, this is not his, this isn't going to mess up his career. It might mess up these other people's career. I didn't publish it because I was worried about messing up my career. And so he's very, very sensitive to the fact that whoever has to release this work, he wants to be able to put enough distance between them, or have someone who can do it that's not going to affect them adversely in the way that it has adversely affect him. And we know from his writings and how earlier things were received that he was very bitter about that. I think he thought that it not necessarily because he's not getting the things that he wants, but because he's being misunderstood, because his ideas are just being dismissed as being atheistic. And so that it's just prejudices and dogmas of the time that are dismissing his ideas. I think that's the piece that really irked him. And that but also really motivated. He could have just not release this at all. He could have just forgotten about it, but he didn't. He very much wanted this to come out because I think he knew how influential. I think he knew the value of what it is that he had written, not only as a piece of important philosophy, but also as something that would endure, something as a work of literature that people would be praising and studying for years to come. Perhaps he had the idea that it would be as influential as it is now, but I suspect that he had no idea that it would be just as influential as it has been. Because it's at some point your humility is going to want to kick in and be oh, this might be very important, but it's not going to be as important 50 years, 100 years, 200 years from now. That's you're going to want to maintain a little bit. I think Hume certainly had more humility than that. Um, but I know that it would have just been absolutely devastating had I been in those shoes. So, the two big tragedies for me are Hume's dialogues and Herman Melville's Moby Dick, in that the success of both of those masterpieces weren't felt in the lifetimes of their authors. It wasn't until well after their deaths that those works were recognized for the important masterpieces that they are. And as a writer, the thought of like something that I'm writing, like I will never be able to, if it is going to be successful, just on this off chance that something I write is like to not see the success of what it is you're written. God, that's just devastating to think about.
If you're watching this, then I just wanted to let you know that you can access the same content in audio-only form by subscribing via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Audible. In fact, you can search for the Socratic Sessions in your favourite podcast app, and whilst you're there, please leave a 5-star review. It helps others to discover these conversations. All links are in the description, and thank you. So I've got one more thing to say and one more question on this, and then we'll move on to other aspects of Hume. So just for the listener and viewers that are aware, so the last atheist to be killed in the UK by hanging occurred in 1697, and Hume was born in 1711. So this happened 14 years prior to his birth, but obviously it was still something that was felt, right? This was in Edinburgh, in Hume's hometown.
Well, and they didn't know that was going to be the last one at the time.
Precisely.
We know it's the last one now.
There's always the chance.
but no, you're absolutely right. This was something that was very fresh in his mind and something that he was very much aware of. And his contemporaries, the company that he kept, was very aware. The Baron de Albuck was a notorious atheist of the time. And he was very aware, they had their meetings in secret because there was this chance that, hey, religious fervent extremism in politics could rise up, and all of a sudden heretics are starting to be burned again. Because, politics back then was an up and down sort of thing, and it was whatever the trends were of the time that you had to conform to, or you could find yourself, burning at the stake, which is, obviously 200 years plus separated from it. Just thinking on it now is just so wild. But you also have to keep in mind, during this time, dueling was legal. There were, statutes of the legal ways in which you could duel other people. And so it's just a wild, if you were to insult someone in just the wrong way back then, you could be challenged to a duel, and your public honor would be on the line. I can't imagine my writing having to navigate a world like that.
No, I mean, this is why I love reading things like Dostoevsky or people like that. You're reading about Russia and other places in Europe where they go and visiting, and there's dueling going on. There's different ways of living. There's different class systems that were completely alien to us today. It's the world's changed so much, and we just aren't aware of how fortunate we are. I think sometimes to live in the time and place that we do, to be able to freely speak about these things without the fear of the gallows or the pyre or whatever.
Yeah.
So the sort of final question I wanted to kind of really land on with the dialogues concerning natural religion is something that we've spoken about, I think, either on Twitter or in email before, just in passing. You were kind of saying that, when you look at kind of the most well-known theologians today, looking at something like Alvin Plantinga, for instance, a very well-known, very well-respected philosopher of religion. You're kind of you said in passing, Ben, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so if I'm wrong here, please tell me, but that they don't touch some of the items within the dialogue concerning natural religion, because the dialogues concerning natural religion seem to have almost splintered various elements of the philosophy of religion that people are not scared to come to, but don't know how to navigate now. Would you mind kind of just picking up that sort of thread and just hammering that home for us?
Yeah, so Alfred North Whitehead had a very famous quote where he said that all of Western philosophy is but a footnote to Plato. And so what he's getting at in that quip is that Plato's work has been so influential that really what contemporary philosophy consists of is responding to the various questions that Plato asked, posed to us, and the solutions in which are the answers that we give to those questions. And I think there's a very similar analogy that can be made with David Hume and the philosophy of religion, in the sense that most of philosophy of religion nowadays is still a response to David Hume's work. The very, like, why do we discuss, design arguments, cosmological arguments, ontological arguments, and the problem of evil? Why are those, why is that the way everything is divided up? We see that in Hume's dialogues. Why do we see these sort of splintered views of the evidentialists and then the non-evidentialists? So the evidentialists are the natural theologians like Cleanthes, trying to find a rational foundation for religion within something like science. So, the modern figure today would be Richard Swinburne. But there's another approach that says that we shouldn't know that evidential approach is a dead end. This is very much what Demea says of Cleanthes in the dialogues, and so someone like Demea would be like Alvin Plantinga today in his Reformed epistemology. This idea that, look, we can have a knowledge of God beyond, that's not dependent on evidence. Our knowledge of God can be what he says is properly basic. We have this properly functioning sensus divinitatis, and this sensus divinitatis is a faculty of our minds that brings us into direct contact with the divine. And so that we can just have this non-inferential knowledge of God. So this kind of goes around the natural theologian and concedes, look, the project of natural theology does not succeed. So we don't want to put our religious faith on evidential grounds. We want to put them on something else, something that's not merely a relation of ideas or a matter of fact. And so I think those two warring camps are just a continuation of Hume pitting Demea and Cleanthes against one another. Another way in which you see this is, Cleanthes has an anthropomorphic model of God. God resembles our minds. Divine intelligence is like human intelligence. It has thoughts and beliefs and desires and intentions, and its, mind is demarcated by time. He has, thoughts at this time and different thoughts at another time. And so that this is, the anthropomorphic model of God. Whereas Demea has more of the classical theist model of God, where God's nature is incomprehensible. God is not a being among beings, he is being itself. He is wholly simple and totally immutable. So the first model, the anthropomorphic model, we're worried about anthropomorphism. We're worried about making ourselves the model of the universe. We're thinking, it seems idolatrous to make ourselves the model of the universe. And so this is exactly what a lot of Catholics will say to Protestants. They will say, look, you've anthropomorphized God. You've taken the mysteriousness and the awe out of God in a very important way, and you've just made him, kind of like Zeus on Mount Olympus. Just only further, instead of on Mount Olympus, you just put him beyond space and time. And you get this, kind of anthropomorphic God in the clouds with a beard, picture of God. But that Catholic model, the mystic, Thomistic model of total immutability and total simplicity, it's really hard to make sense of a mind. Like if we're saying that God's act is just one single simple act with no distinction in it, well then we have to say that God has no thoughts, no will, no reason, and in a word is no mind at all. And so you have these two warring models, what's often called theistic personalism and then classical theism. And so these are just a continuation of Cleanthes and Demea's, war between these two models, between two theists in Hume's dialogues. Why is the problem of evil so important? Well, because Hume lays out, he's like, look, the Epicurus' logical problem of evil is still a problem. Also, if you think that you can solve that problem by making God finite, well, then we've got this other evidential problem of evil too. That's why we talk about the logical and that's why he even makes that distinction between a logical and an evidential problem of evil. And he just gives, they even have a name these days. They're called Humean arguments from evil. They're essentially abductive arguments from evil. That's Hume's influence. Not necessarily in the dialogues, but in the inquiry, there's of miracles. And so obviously the entire, if anyone familiar with the resurrection of Jesus and the literature that surrounds that, Hume's influence on miracles there is huge. You have to say something to Hume. If you're going to say that it's rational to believe in a miracle, you're not going to be able to say that in a philosophical setting without saying something about Hume. So to my mind, those influences from Hume's really just devastating critiques of the design argument, the two models of God that Hume puts on the table. I would also argue his critiques of the cosmological argument also hold up. Those are considered the weakest part of the dialogues. I don't necessarily agree with that, but that's generally how it's seen. And then obviously his work on the problem of evil. And so it's really hard to look at contemporary philosophy of religion and not see Hume's influence in it. When you read through all the big, influential, important papers and books that have been written over the past 50 years in philosophy of religion, you find a lot of Hume cited in that. You find a lot of Hume and Kant being responded to, because it's really difficult to overemphasize just how much of an influence their work has had on how we think about these questions and how we're going to keep thinking about these. And by the way, so Hume's dialogues are modeled after Cicero's on the nature of the gods, on the nature of the God. In that it's a dialogue where different characters are pit, and so really you can see Hume as continuing that tradition, and Hume's, for the foreseeable future, will still be considered an introductory text of, hey, if you want to think about religion seriously, read Hume's dialogues. Start there. And that's one of just the best places you can start.
Yeah, I remember kind of chatting with you about dialogues concerning natural religion and asking you kind of, what should I read beforehand? What should I do? X, Y, Z? And you were saying, no, actually just read it. Like, sure, have secondary sources that go into each section and give you a bit more of a breakdown. That's absolutely fine, but it is possible to pick up the dialogues concerning natural religion, read it from start to finish, and learn things and come away from it being enriched. Sure, you're not going to get everything. It's a very, very comprehensive, deep text, but it's still readable. There's still stuff you pick up from it. Yeah. And as you said,
there are a few barriers here and there, but they're few and far between. So, and by barriers, I mean, so he uses the word vulgar. So that doesn't necessarily, when we hear the word vulgar, we think of like a curse word or something. And so what he means by vulgar is common. So if he says vulgar experience, he means common experience. If he says vulgar people, he just means common people. And so it's not supposed to have this negative, pejorative sense to it. So as long as you are aware that that's just how this language was used back then, those barriers are very, very small. You're very right in that it's very accessible. You can pick it up and you can just start reading it. And really, the ideas will be clear. If you have familiarity with philosophy, it'll be one of the easiest things you've ever read. Even if you're not familiar with philosophy, it's a great way to start familiarizing yourself with philosophy. Really working over it over and over again. An audiobook is excellent in this regard because it's usually a British narrator who has really worked out the inflections and the prose that Hume is, because the punctuation feels very sporadic, but it's there because Hume expects it to be read in a certain way, and an audiobook narrator will read it to you in that way, and you'll go, wow, this is just incredibly well written. And again, the originality is obviously the clarity. The clarity is something that always strikes me every time I go back and read Hume. I just finished a reread of an Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, and I've read that a dozen times at least. But every time I read it, I'm like, God, this is just so clear. Like I understand. Like I don't have answers, I don't have solutions, but the problems are very, very clear.
It's fascinating. I think that's something compared to, like, I don't know, Friedrich Nietzsche or something. Obviously, also a juggernaut of his time and place, but so much more complicated potentially to actually be able to pick up and engage with that. Like
Yeah.
Beyond Good and Evil, like that's heavy and hard, and you think you should be able to engage with it,
Don't
but it's
start with
just
Nietzsche or Hegel. You will.
yeah,
It will
you'll
be
burn
very
out.
painful.
Yeah. Okay, so we've hit sort of Hume as the historian, we've hit Hume as the ethicist, we've spoken a lot about Hume as the philosopher of religion. Hume was obviously also known for his sort of political works. So I guess it'd be interesting to understand, Ben, kind of how his views on politics and government influence his contemporaries, as well as sort of subsequent political thinkers.
So yeah, I'll be honest and say that of Hume's works, I've read his political works the least. Um, Political philosophy just hasn't been my forte, so to speak. But Hume's, for his time, was a very influential conservative thinker, and so he had very influential writings stemming from things like property rights to what sort of role the state had in allocating both property rights and the establishments of certain laws, the ways in which legislatures could have legitimate authority over a populace, um, big questions like this. And so I think I had mentioned earlier, so he was close friends with Adam Smith, certain economists of his time, as well as other political figures. So he was a really big influence in those circles of really kind of maintaining. I don't want to say the social order of the time because a lot of his um, ideas did buck the tide of the time, but a lot of his ideas are also what would go on to influence conservative thinking in Europe, especially in the English speaking world. So, anyone that is familiar with British politics will be familiar with Tory and Labour. And so, really, the Tory party in the wake of Hume developed a lot of his political thought. Again, his thought was also very influential on figures like John Stuart Mill and other rising utilitarians. And so they were political philosophers as well. John Stuart Mill is very, very widely influential, not only just because of his thought in utilitarianism, but also because of his um, political ideas on liberty. Is one of the pamphlets that he wrote, and so there you can find echoes of Hume's ideas in there. So Hume was um, very influential in this realm. I just wish I knew more about the depth of um, that political influence. It's just one of those things. I know I just need to read it more because it's been a hot minute since I've dove into those texts.
That's all good, my friend. You've been amazing. Like the knowledge that's in your head on David Hume baffles me. So there you go. Okay, so we've kind of I guess, broadly touched various elements of Hume's life. There's obviously other sort of contemporaries and friends and figures that we could dive into at this point. I think I don't want to kind of just keep pushing for the sake of keep pushing. So, Ben, I kind of got one real final question on Hume, which is around this sort of, is there anything that we've missed whilst addressing Hume and his life and his work? Like, are there any sort of key things that you wanted to talk about in this conversation, which I've neglected to ask?
Yeah, so my big Humean takeaway, we've already obviously hit on it a good bit, is this idea of Hume's fork. So, kind of beginning our knowledge in this idea of a priori and a posteriori knowledge, this idea that we can have relations of ideas and matters of fact. I find this to be a very, very useful starting point. Now, with that said, I don't know if that's the whole story. I don't think that we can just limit ourselves there. And so this brings me into what I think is the most important feature of Hume's philosophy and probably the most um, confused by people on the outside who want to kind of dismiss Hume very easily without really fully understanding Hume's view is. So Hume's view is very much based in what's called Pyrrhonian skepticism. So the Pyrrhonians were a Greek sect of philosophers that thought knowledge was impossible, both a priori and a posteriori knowledge. And so that what our intellect and inquiry should do is suspend judgment on all matters and achieve a state of what they call ataraxia. So kind of this, blissful state of ignorance, really, of just not being able. And so the Sextus Empiricus is probably our best source of this strain of skeptical thought. And so they motivate it with what they see to be is invincible arguments against the possibility of knowledge that arise from our very attempts to put our knowledge on firmer ground. So to give an example, there's a famous Agrippa's trilemma. So this idea, how do I know something is true? Well, I can prove it. Well, so then how do you prove that proof? Is it another proof? Is it proofs all the way down? Do you have some system of circular proofs? Or do you just take something without proof? And so these three options are all three not great. So an infinite regress of proofs, you wouldn't be able, it would just be turtles all the way down. You'd never be able to get to knowledge. It would just forever be beyond your reach. Using a proof to prove the same thing is circular. And so, circular arguments don't support their conclusion. So that option is just straight up invalid. And then the third option is dogma. It's just kind of faith. It's just taking it on faith, foregoing proof altogether. And so either way, it seems like we're going to end up in this radical skeptical position. And so Hume was very sympathetic to this. So this is a priori. We found this problem a priori. He thinks there are similar problems a posteriori in the matters of fact, the problem of induction. This idea that there's this inductive principle we can neither have evidence for or against. We have to just take it on faith, just like we had to, take something as true in the relation of ideas without proof. Like there's just something that we have to take as true. And so Hume sees these two prongs of his fork basically crumble under him under the weight of the arguments of Pyrrhonian skepticism. Well, he also sees Pyrrhonian skepticism as unlivable. So if I were to just suspend judgment on all things, I wouldn't be able to navigate my life. Like I'd go down the stairs because I think, jumping out the window will cause me to fall to the ground and hurt myself. Well, if I'm a Pyrrhonian skeptic, none of those are things I have knowledge of. I have just as much reason to jump out the window as I do to go down the stairs. And so Pyrrhonian skepticism is practically unlivable, even if it's in principle the only thing that can be justified. And so Hume's solution is, look, we can be philosophers, but we have to first remember to be men, to be human, and that it's just part of human nature to take something like the idea of proof, the idea of knowledge, the idea of the inductive principle, and we just go live our life. And so the only place that these skeptical worries don't have any force is on our everyday life. Like, you can tell me that motion is impossible, Zeno's paradox, and that motion is, but then I just go move. And so my own experience, the examples of my own life, are enough to refute it. So Hume thinks that so long as our inquiries remain within the domain of common life, where our understanding works, we're good. We don't have the threat of Pyrrhonian skepticism is not there. It's when we go beyond common life, it's when we go beyond human understanding, that we end up in problems, and that these skeptical doubts start to get generated. All of a sudden, Pyrrhonian skepticism is on the same footing. And so the idea is a mitigated skepticism, a mitigated Pyrrhonian skepticism, what Hume calls an academic skepticism, that says, look, skepticism is not going to have any sway in common ordinary life. But when we go beyond common ordinary life, now skepticism is on the same footing as whatever metaphysical speculation that we have. And so our metaphysical speculations and our empirical inquiries are only immune from skepticism insofar as they're proportioned to the evidence. So you often hear associated with Hume, the wise man often proportions his belief to the evidence. What he's saying here is we are only licensed to go in our judgments insofar as they're proportioned to evidence. When we go further, Pyrrhonian skepticism kicks in, and now we're basically, it's a wash. We have to suspend judgment like the Pyrrhonians did and seek this state of ataraxia, this agnostic suspense of judgment. So Hume's not saying that there's this problem of induction and we have to embrace this radical form of Pyrrhonian skepticism. No, it's a mitigated form of Pyrrhonian skepticism. But it has important implications. It means that abstruse metaphysical speculations license abstruse metaphysical rejoinders. So you might say, you could say, well, the universe began to exist, so the universe must have a cause because whatever begins to exist has a cause. Well, now you've taken causation beyond common life and into the two eternities, the before and after now, the beginning of the universe. That's a metaphysical speculation, and all we need to refute that is a similar abstruse metaphysical speculation. We could just say, at that level of reality, things can just pop into existence or can go on exist forever, and that this idea of our causal principles working at this level, as long as I can put together a story that makes sense within our common life, that's a defeater for that abstruse metaphysical reasoning. It's just like Hume's intelligence principle and vegetation and generation. At some point, it just becomes a wash where we don't have any understanding that's going to help us decide for these. And all of our metaphysical speculation is going to be like that. We're eventually going to get to a point where we're so far beyond human experience that all of these metaphysical arguments are going to be on the same footing. They're going to have contradictory conclusions, and we're not going to have any way of deciding between them.
Yeah. And I'll just kind of say that I think Hume does an amazing job of leveling that within, obviously, quite a lot of his works, but specifically within Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, as he kind of challenges and pushes back on some of the things being presented to him. He just does it in such a beautiful way. Ben, it's been fantastic to speak with you today. Obviously, we've covered somebody's life, touching on various elements. And as I said right at the start, listener, viewer, I hope this is giving you a desire or fuel to go away and engage further with David Hume's works. Ben, before I let you disappear, where would you want to point people to follow along with your work and your sort of research and study? Obviously, we've mentioned Real Atheology, but do you have your own space as well they could check out?
So I do have my personal Twitter account, or it's X now. So at Speed Watkins, you can find me, and so that's usually where, if I'm working on something, that's where I'm usually soundboarding ideas from other philosophers. Obviously, Real Atheology, a philosophy of religion podcast. We're available wherever podcasts are available. We're available on YouTube. We have a Facebook page. We have a Twitter page. So you can look us up that way. I am in the process still of doing an entire series on Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion. So I'll go through each of the 12 sections in depth, give you kind of all the background to what's going on in those sections. But I'm also doing interviews with other people. Some of my interviews have been with people who have never read dialogues before. Others are with Hume scholars who have published on certain sections. And so one of the Professor Joe Campbell, was nice enough to come on and discuss section 9, which was the cosmological argument. And so one of the things that I want to provide through our project is the resources for people to dive into Hume in a way that's not only accessible, but also relevant to their journeys in the philosophy of religion. Because I know how overwhelming it can be when you get interested in the philosophy of religion, of where do I jump in? Like, where do I start? And what is a clear, simple, concise way to get to dive into those big questions? And I think that project will help people achieve that end. And so be sure to check us out, subscribe us, and be on the lookout for future episodes on Hume's dialogues.
Amazing. I managed to have a cheeky back look at all the work that you've put into to that Hume series, and it's. I mean, I was saying to you as I was reading through it, it's basically like you've gone away and done a PhD on this subject, like a thesis, and you're going to be presenting that. So I'm super excited for it. I'll make sure there's links to that when it goes live in this video as well. So if it's been a few years' time, who knows? Somebody's watching this. If it's gone live by then, there'll be a link in the description. So yeah, enjoy that. Anyway, Ben, will it be this year? Amazing.
Will be this year.
Amazing. Okay, I'm looking forward to it, mate. I'm really looking forward to it. Dude, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me on. It was so much fun.
Thanks for checking out this episode. Please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And make sure you check us out over on Locals. Cheers.